From Broadcasting House, this is BBC World News.
Hello, you're watching BBC World News. I'm Naga Manchetti. Here are our top stories. UN inspectors are preparing to visit the site of an alleged chemical attack on civilians in a suburb of Damascus. The Syrian president says US military intervention in his country would end in failure. The Afghan president will meet with the Pakistani Prime Minister later to try to negotiate the release of high-profile Taliban prisoners in an effort to put the Afghan peace process back on track. The disgraced Chinese politician Bo Xilai has made his closing statement to the court on day 5 of his trial. The prosecution said that there should be no leniency for Mr. Bo, who's accused of corruption and abuse of office. And thousands of Californian firefighters are struggling in dangerous conditions to contain a massive wildfire which is threatening Yosemite National Park and its famous giant sequoia trees. Several mountain towns are also at risk. Those are the latest headlines from BBC World News. Now for the latest financial news with Alice.
Calls for coordination are rejected. Federal Reserve officials say they only care about the health of the US economy and confirm that they'll not consider the impact their economic policies are having on other markets around the world. Now, he co-founded the biggest company in the world, and now Apple inventor Steve Wozniak tells us where he thinks Microsoft will be in the future. Very warm welcome to you. This is World Business Report. I'm Alice Baxter. In just a minute, we'll let you know exactly what the co-founder of Apple thinks of all the changes at the top of Microsoft. But first this hour, despite the rather beautiful backdrop of the Jackson Hole Mountains, disagreement and divisions was the order of the day in Jackson Hole after Federal Reserve officials rebuffed calls to coordinate with their emerging market neighbours. After a turbulent week which saw stock markets in the developing world tumble, there are increasing calls for the US to discuss with other nations how it plans to rein in its $85 billion a month stimulus package. But over the weekend, Federal Reserve officials rejected calls to consider the impact that their tapering plan could have on the emerging markets. Instead, senior Fed officials declared that their mandate was to consider the health of the American economy only. Now, the US decision is not set to commit to any unified program at this stage, and it's already resulted in a backlash from officials in Mexico, Turkey, South Africa and India. Even the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, called for the caution on this, saying that the Federal Reserve shouldn't rush any changes to its stimulus program. Well, joining me now live on the line is one lady that did attend the meetings herself, Pippa Malmgren. She's currently President of Principal Palace, and she previously was Chief Liaison Officer between the White House and the Federal Reserve. Pippa, many thanks for joining us here on the programme this morning.
Sure.
Good to see you. Would you agree with that assessment? Is that a fair interpretation of what happened at Jackson Hole? Did the United States effectively turn around to the rest of the world and say, look, guys, our own economy is our prime concern. You're kind of on your own?
Well, that's always been the situation with monetary policy. It's always about your own domestic economy. But I think what's important is the attitude of the Federal Reserve is that emerging markets could have managed the hot money inflows that came with quantitative easing by letting their currencies appreciate and by pushing interest rates up, and they chose not to do that. So now when the hot money goes out, when quantitative easing goes away, they can't really complain, is the basic view.
And yet, was there no sense that some sort of a unified approach could be taken? Yes, perhaps the responsibility lies on those economies themselves, but surely a more coherent policy could be taken.
No, absolutely no discussion, and there won't be any discussion on that front. And the Fed, just to be clear about where they stand, I mean, everybody talks about tapering, but one of the Fed presidents put it this way. He said, you know, the tradition is that the role of the Federal Reserve is to take the punch bowl away from the party before everybody gets too drunk, and that what the Fed is doing with tapering is adding alcohol a little less rapidly. That is what tapering is, right? So they're not taking anything away. And if the emerging markets are already going to get in a twist over this, then we have a lot more to come. And the was get ready.
So
That's
the
your
analogy
problem.
of us all slowly being eased off our alcohol dependence. And yet, is the Fed in any way being affected by these calls for caution from not only central banks from emerging markets around the world, including Mexico, Turkey, etc., but also from Christine Lagarde herself?
Well, I think to be clear, everybody understands emerging markets are going to have a bumpy time, but it's not exclusively because of U.S. monetary policy. Some of it is to do with the fact that Japan has doubled the monetary base, which has created new competitive problems, for example, for all of South Asia, because the yen has fallen and that has rendered them less competitive. So it's not only about the Federal Reserve.
And Pippa, finally, if you had to place money on who's going to replace Ben Bernanke come January, who would your money be on?
Have to say, it looks like Larry Summers, even though he's considered a very tricky and controversial choice, and everyone expects he may be one of the least collegial chairmen we've ever had. Nonetheless, it looks like that is where the president is leaning right now.
OK, thanks, Pippa Malmgren there, putting her money there on Larry Summers. Many thanks for joining us hot out of Jackson Hole. Many thanks. Now, Apple founders Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak famously built the first Apple computer kit in the garage at Jobs' home. Well, the company is now one of the most valuable in the world. Our chief business correspondent Linda Yu sat down with the inventor and co-founder of Apple to talk about some of the challenges ahead for the company. She kicked off the interview by asking what he thought about Steve Ballmer's decision to leave Microsoft.
I think in some kind of real dollar terms, I think Microsoft's been falling for quite a long time, hasn't had really great new surprises, just sort of resting on, their markets that they built up a long, long time ago. And that's pretty dangerous. I don't know how the world judges Steve Ballmer, but I don't think his time there was as important and significant as Bill Gates.
Paul Krugman seems to write on everything for the New York Times. He was saying that he thinks that some of the problems of Microsoft you'll see in Apple.
Apple's a big company and still was able to come up with, at least under the leadership of Steve Jobs, the great new directions of the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and how much our life has changed in recent times. And we were a huge company full of management and bureaucracy and all that stuff. And usually a big company cannot move fast. Apple found the formulas, and they're still there.
Is Tim Cook the right person to lead Apple?
Yeah, Steve Jobs had very strong feelings about what makes a company great and what makes products great, and he more or less chose Tim Cook to be in that role and that position. Everybody sort of says, oh my gosh, 2 years have passed, and we need something really new and great from Apple. Well, yeah, the great advances for mankind don't happen every year.
How is it that companies like Samsung have begun to rival Apple? What are they doing right?
A lot of the greatness in our products has come about from manufacturing technologies, being able to make things very small at very low cost. Things like a camera built into a phone doesn't cost $100 to put in the phone, it just costs a few dollars. The chips, now you can put almost the entire phone and the entire smarts onto one chip that might cost the manufacturer $1 to make, So these are the things that make the products great. Samsung had great marketing prowess. They also had distribution channels and reps in so many markets of the world that Apple was not in, because Apple more or less grew up under the Macintosh, which had a low world market share. It's very difficult to move in where people are already, you're going up against people that already have the connections, the business strategies, the business methodologies of those other parts of the world. So it's going to be a fight for Apple, and a worthy fight, and it's something that in business you should do.
Now, some other news to bring you up to speed on. Greece may need a third bailout, but would not accept new austerity measures, the Greek finance minister has said. Yanis Stournaris added that he thinks Greece might need another $9 billion in assistance, but that any new fund should be seen as a long-term loan rather than a bailout with a strict conditionality attached. Well, Greece has already received 2 bailouts totaling $320 billion. A New York appeals court has ruled that Argentina must pay back more than $1.3 billion to a group of investors 11 years after its record debt default. But Argentina has said it will continue to refuse to pay anything to investors who declined to participate in a previous debt reduction deal. Now, Argentina is set to lodge an appeal with the Supreme Court. Now, after a turbulent time for the emerging markets last week, as I was just saying, let's take a quick look at how shares are faring in Asia today and cross over live to Rico Hizon, who's in our Singapore bureau for us. Singapore, how are the markets over in Asia doing this morning?
Well, sentiment is quite good in midday trading, Alice. And Asian investors are basically trading on this steep drop in U.S. home sales, giving them hope that the U.S. Central Bank will hold off scaling back its stimulus initiatives. Regional stocks are in positive territory, and gold is hitting a near 3-month high on these developments. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index rising on the back of properties and banking stocks. Australia's moving up with financials and miners supporting the market. And South Korea's Kospi is advancing with automakers and shipbuilders rallying today. Emerging Asian markets, currencies are trading higher versus the dollar on the back of this poor U.S. report. Alice.
And Rico, I want to ask you about China's construction bank, but I don't have time to do it, so we're going to have to leave it there. Rico, many thanks for that update from Singapore. From me, from Rico, from the business team, bye. Thanks for watching.